Hello again, and welcome to another Open the Book. Last week, we heard about how David, the shepherd boy, was anointed by Samuel to be the next king, even though Saul was at that time still the king. Saul had forgotten his promises to God to be a good king. He had become jealous and greedy and a liar. And today, we hear how his jealousy got the better of him. So let's open the book and read the story, The Two Kings. This is the story of two kings. The first is King Saul. He's had an argument with God. Saul isn't talking to God anymore, and he doesn't want to hear what God is trying to tell him. Saul is in a bad mood. And the other king is... Well, the story's definitely called Two Kings, but I wonder who the other king could be. Well, it's a young lad called David. He doesn't look like a king. He looks like a young shepherd looking after his father's sheep. But he is the other king in this story. But he's not king yet. It's true that the prophet Samuel has already told David that God has chosen him to be the next king, but he knew the time wasn't yet right. So David carried on looking after his father's sheep. David's family was confused. What's the point of choosing him as king if he's going to stay here with the sheep? Said one brother. King Saul has a son already. Surely he will be the next king, wondered another. Maybe it's all a mistake, said another. David wasn't worried. I don't know what God's plan is. All I know is that Samuel said, God has chosen me. Meanwhile, Saul, the other king, was feeling even worse, and that meant he behaved badly. Get out of my way, he would roar and shout. Sometimes he would even throw things. And when Saul was like this, all his advisers and servants would try to think of ways to calm him down. Your Majesty, suggested one of the servants, perhaps some music would soothe you and make you feel better. Let me send for a shepherd boy I know. David is his name. He plays the harp beautifully. Saul shrugged his shoulders and said, Oh, all right, but it won't make any difference. And so the servant sent for David to come in from his fields with his harp. David bowed to the king and began to play his lovely music. He played songs that reminded Saul that God loved him and that the world was a good place. And soon Saul relaxed and began to smile. The servants and advisers were so relieved that they wanted David to stay forever. But David knew that wasn't what God had planned. So he asked permission from the king to return to the farm to help his father. And Saul, who had forgotten all about David now he was feeling better, waved his hand and said, Of course. David's brothers were surprised to see him home, looking after the sheep again. When you went to the palace, we expected you to take over as king, said one. You'll never be king if you keep coming home, criticised another. But David wasn't worried. No, he said, Saul is our king until God shows me it is the right time. And so he carried on, looking after his father's sheep as God had told him to. Meanwhile, King Saul was in a seriously bad mood again, and with good reason. His country was under attack by his enemies. Saul ordered all his troops to the battlefield. David's brothers joined the army, but he was too young and had to stay at home. Yes, looking after the sheep. But after a few weeks, he took some extra food and some clean clothes to his brothers camped on the battlefield. When he got there, he heard that Goliath, the great giant of a man in the enemy army, was challenging King Saul to fight him. What shall I do? What shall I do? King Saul cried out. Not even my bravest soldier will fight him. Saul was a very worried man. But David wasn't worried. If God is with us, who can be against us? With God's help, even I could beat that loudmouth, he said. David's brothers laughed at him. King Saul laughed at him. But David wasn't worried. He trusted God, and when he faced that giant, he swung his sling around and whack, sent a stone flying in the middle of the giant's head, and whack, down he fell. King Saul and David were so excited. "Victory! Victory!" they shouted together. "God is for us!" And all the soldiers cheered, "Hooray for David!" And all the people said, "David, our hero!" Everyone wanted to give David rewards and medals and make him a general in the army. But David knew this wasn't what God wanted, and so instead he offered himself to serve King Saul. But Saul's happiness didn't last for long. His bad mood came back. He felt jealous of all the cheering for David. He was afraid people would want David as king instead of him. And from that day, Saul secretly plotted to kill David. Well, we shall have to wait until next week to see what happens. But now, let's think about David. I expect we'd all love to be a hero and be brave like David. David was a good shepherd. Day after day he cared for the sheep, which gave him the courage and the skill to fight and defeat the giant. And remember, David trusted God all the time, not just when things were difficult. I wonder if you can think of something you've learnt this week that will help you in the future. It might be in the classroom or something you've learnt in the playground. Have you been learning that lesson well, like David did? Now I'm going to say a prayer. If you'd like to make that prayer your own, then say Amen at the end after me. Dear God, help us to prepare ourselves for whatever the future holds by following David's example and learning the lessons of today well. Amen. Bye-bye.